welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute ultimate corporate takeover playbook. I mean, we are looking at how a humble, everyday spice trading outfit pulled off the most staggering acquisition in human history. Seriously, it's wild. I'm talking about the British East India Company. We're going to break down exactly how this business entity shifted from simple trade to complete, undeniable sovereign rule over an entire subcontinent. Let's just jump right into it. Now, as we go through this explainer, we really need to shift our mindset. Listen to this quote. A rogue multinational corporation, one that was set out to trade, but also have powers to take land, to wage war. You see, you really shouldn't think of the East India Company as a nation or a government. Think of them as a rogue multinational corporation, one that was heavily armed, entirely profit-driven, and owned by private shareholders. They were out to trade, sure, but they quickly figured out that having the power to take land and literally wage war, well, that was absolutely excellent for their bottom line.
Now, what's really interesting about this comparison here is the sheer scale of power we're talking about. Think of the biggest, most influential companies today. Apple, Google, Facebook. They have massive digital influence, billions of users, right? But imagine if they had their own private armies, their own independent justice systems, the ability to print their own physical currency, and the legal right to declare war on sovereign nations. No way, right? But that is exactly the kind of unprecedented corporate power the East India Company eventually wielded.
Phase 1. Market entry and lobbying. So how on earth did they pull this off? Well, every great corporate takeover begins with a strategy to crack into a massive, heavily guarded new market. Founded in 1600 as a joint stock company by just 125 shareholders who pulled together £70,000, their original business plan was simply to trade spices in Indonesia. But there was a problem: the Dutch. The Dutch company was way better funded, had a stronger army, and essentially boxed them right out. So, as any smart business does, the East India Company pivoted to a new market: India. In 1608, they landed in Surat. At first, they were blocked, mostly because Portuguese competitors had already lobbied the ruling Mughal Empire. But by 1615, they sent a diplomat, Sir Thomas Roe, armed with absolutely lavish gifts for the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. This successful corporate lobbying secured them an exclusive royal decree to set up factories in exchange for an annual fee. Once they had their foot in the door, man, their business was booming. They traded cotton, indigo, silk, and eventually opium and tea. But, polite diplomacy wasn't really enough to satisfy their shareholders. They wanted to aggressively eliminate competition and maximize their ease of trade. Phase 2. Exploiting loopholes. Okay, so to scale their operations, they went back to their home government and lobbied for a massive upgrade to their corporate charter. In 1670, English King Charles II granted them some truly unbelievable rights. They were legally permitted to acquire territory, mint money, command a private army, form alliances, and even declare war. I mean, the English crown effectively handed a private company the legal powers of an imperial state. They were no longer just merchants. They were practically an agent of imperialism. But as you might expect, they got a little too arrogant way too quickly. In 1686, the company's governor, Josiah Child, decided to use this brand new private army to actually declare war on the mighty Mughal Empire. Why? Because the new emperor, Aurangzeb, rejected their petition for tax cuts in Bengal. This was a colossal business blunder. The company's tiny army was absolutely crushed by the Mughals' 4 million-strong forces. Their factories were seized, and Josiah Child literally had to bow down and beg for forgiveness. Aurangzeb forgave them, but slapped them with a massive 150,000 rupee fine. To put that into perspective, that's about 350 million rupees today. So, they learned a valuable lesson. Brute force wasn't going to work just yet. They needed patience and legal loopholes. Fast forward to 1717. The Mughal Empire was weakening after Aurangzeb's death, and the company managed to manipulate the new emperor, Farrukh Siyar, into granting them the absolute ultimate corporate tax loophole, the Dustok. This special trade permit allowed the company to completely waive all custom and transit duties in Bengal. They essentially paid 0 taxes, draining the local Mughal revenue and giving the company a totally unfair monopolistic market advantage. Phase 3. The hostile takeover. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is the turning point where aggressive trade disputes evolved into a literal corporate buyout and regime change.
The local rulers, the Nawabs of Bengal, were getting seriously fed up with the East India Company abusing that stock tax loophole and disrespecting their authority. In 1756, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, finally had enough. He marched on Calcutta, attacked the company's Fort William, and jailed British officers in a tiny cell, an event known as the Black Hole Tragedy, where many of them died. For the East India Company, this wasn't just a tragedy, it was the perfect pretext they needed to launch a full-scale regime change to protect their corporate assets.
But rather than just fighting a standard war, company executive Robert Clive approached the 1757 Battle of Plassey like a calculated, step-by-step corporate conspiracy. First, they bribed Siraj-ud-Dowlah's own army commander Mir Jafar. Second, they secured financing for this coup from the Jagat Seth family. These were powerful local bankers who opposed the Nawab. Because of this inside job, the company won the battle easily, despite being vastly outnumbered. Third, they installed Mir Jafar as the new Nawab of Bengal. He was, for all intents and purposes, a puppet CEO installed by a foreign corporation.
Phase 4. Becoming the state.
So the East India Company had achieved indirect political power, but they soon realized that puppet rulers were actually pretty bad for business. They kept rebelling and, worse, cutting into profits. This all culminated when the puppet rulers formed an alliance with the Mughal Emperor to try and eradicate the company's influence entirely, leading to the 1764 Battle of Buxar. But by this time, the company's military was just too strong, and they completely crushed this unified alliance. The company executives essentially decided they were done dealing with middlemen. They were going to take over the management themselves. In 1765, following their victory, they forced the Mughal Emperor to sign the Treaty of Allahabad, granting the company the Diwani rights of Bengal. Now, this is absolutely crucial. This legally gave a private corporation the right to collect taxes directly from the people of Bengal. This is the exact moment they officially shifted their revenue stream from purely trade to sovereign taxation. They were no longer just a company operating in Bengal, they literally were the state.
Phase 5. Aggressive expansion.
With tax revenue from Bengal now funding their ever-growing private military, the East India Company was suddenly flush with cash. And they used some brilliant, albeit incredibly dark, legal and military frameworks to swallow up the rest of the subcontinent. One of their most devious business tactics was the subsidiary alliance. They would approach local rulers and offer them a deal: disband your own army, and we will provide our troops for your protection. But the catch was the local ruler had to pay the company for this service. It was essentially a mafia-style protection racket. The genius of it was that it neutralized rival armies and forced local kings to foot the bill for the company's massive military expansion. And if a ruler couldn't pay, well, the company simply confiscated their territory as a penalty. Then, in the mid-19th century, Lord Dalhousie introduced an even more ruthless legal loophole: the doctrine of lapse. Under this incredibly strict policy, if an allied Indian ruler died without a natural male heir, their kingdom would automatically lapse and become the property of the East India Company. And wow, did they rapidly stack up those corporate acquisitions. Between 1848 and 1856, they used this exact legal loophole to seize Satara, Udaipur, Nagpur, Jhansi, and Awadh. They swallowed up massive, incredibly wealthy territories without having to fire a single shot, just purely through relentless, aggressive corporate policy and legal maneuvering.
Phase 6. The ultimate monopoly.
By combining brute military force, that subsidiary alliance protection racket, and the doctrine of lapse, the company reached its terrifying climax. And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of that power. By 1818, about 2/3 of the Indian subcontinent was under their direct or indirect control. A staggering 78% of the population living in the subcontinent was living under the rule of a single, profit-driven private corporation. It really is the ultimate monopoly. But monopolies of this extreme rarely last without a breaking point. The relentless exploitation, the annexations, the total disrespect for local culture, it all culminated in the massive revolt of 1857, which is often called the First War of Independence. Now, while the company and British forces ultimately defeated the revolutionaries, the British government realized a private company could just no longer be trusted to manage an entire subcontinent. So in 1858, they passed an act that officially nationalized the East India Company. All its territories, its immense wealth, and its massive military forces were seized by the British Crown, officially beginning the British Raj. The corporation itself was dissolved shortly after. We've seen how a group of merchants used lobbying, tax loopholes, corporate buyouts, and private armies to transition from a simple spice trading company into an imperial sovereign, which leaves us with a pretty provocative, lingering thought. If a private corporation, driven purely by shareholder profit, could systematically conquer an entire subcontinent in the past, well, how carefully should we be looking at the way we regulate unchecked corporate power and monopolies today? Think about that as you reflect on this incredible piece of history. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.